Hello everyone and welcome to the second instalment of Economics for Workers, a video presentation series held by the Communist Party of Ireland and Socialist Voice. Tonight we have with us Michael Roberts, the economic historian. He's the author of The Long Depression. He blogs at The Next Recession at WordPress and was an economist at the City of London for 40 years. So Michael, thanks for coming on tonight.
Well, thank you for having me, Eugene, and for CPI having me. It's an honor to participate, and I hope that we have a good discussion about what's going on in the world economy at the moment and in relation to COVID.
Okay, so Michael, we'll get straight into it, I suppose. You would be of the opinion that the current economic crisis that the world is facing can be put down to the Marxist concept of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, that it's not something that has been caused by COVID-19, but rather it's something that has been dramatically highlighted by it. Could you expand on that for us, please?
Yeah, I'll be showing you a few graphs shortly, Eugene, which cover that aspect of things. But the main point to make here is that capitalism has regular and recurring crises. What do we mean by crises? We mean slumps in production, investment, employment, incomes, and therefore people's spending power on a regular and recurring basis. Every 8 to 10 years, there are these sorts of slumps across the world, and particularly in the major economies, so-called West, the capitalist economies. So the world economy does not progress upwards, improving our prosperity and livelihoods and employment. In fact, it moves in booms and slumps, and bumps and drops. And that cycle of boom and slump has to be explained. Modern mainstream economics either ignores it and says that these slumps are sort of by chance or through accident or through some specific thing that can be put right. They do not see anything endemic, anything permanently involved in this process of boom and slump. And the argument of Marx and Engels, going way back, and subsequently other followers of Marxist economics would argue, yes, there is something inherently contradictory in capitalism. It's caused by the fact, primarily, it's not the only factor, but it's the main factor, that over a period of time, there's a tendency for the profitability of capital itself to fall. So as capitalists expand and compete and try to increase production by investing more, they tend to reduce the amount of value that they're getting out of exploiting workers in relative to the amount that they're spending on machinery and the workers themselves. And there's a profitability begins to fall. And when that falls, it reaches a point where capitalists turn the taps off, stop investing, stop employing more people, in fact, reverse that process, and you get a slump. And it takes some time before that slump is unwound by reducing the amount of the workforce, by closing down inefficient companies, and the new and more successful companies then fill up the space, and we start the whole process again. So it's a process of cycle of boom and then slump caused by the changes in profitability that are going on. That's the essence of the argument for a theory of crisis, to explain why it's regular and recurring and not just by chance.
And what would you see as the main shifts in the global capitalist economy in the so-called neoliberal era?
The main what, sorry, Eugene?
The main economic shifts.
Well, what we've seen in the period since, well, it depends how far back you go, but let's just take the last 10 years. I think there are some big shifts. We had a big, humongous slump called the Great Recession now in 2008-9, which affected the majority of the world's economies with one or two exceptions. And that meant that it created a condition where it didn't seem that capitalism could get out of that slump in a normal way and proceed to grow again, at least for a few more years. We entered a very depressed period for capitalism. The national output of all these economies grew at a much lower rate than it did before the Great Recession. Investment was much lower. Employment, although it filled up, did not boost wages at all. Inflation stayed low. This was a very depressed environment. And that meant that we didn't really able to deal with all the issues facing people around the world in terms of poverty, in terms of climate change, in terms of inequalities, because the capitalist economies, even if they wanted to, governments were not able to do so because the economy was so weak. So, and it also meant that we ended what used to exist before that, which was a massive expansion of global trade and investment around the world as the big multinationals expanded across the world into different parts of the world, the so-called third world and so on, to exploit workers more and to improve their profits overseas. With the Great Recession, that process has really ground to a halt. World trade has dropped away. The flows of the capital have slowed down. So what used to be called globalization has now ceased to operate. So that's increased intense rivalry now between the various blocks in the world, between America and Europe, between Europe and America and Asia, and in particular, of course, as I hope we will discuss a bit more, the big new rivalry between the rising economic power of China and the relatively declining economic power of the United States, which is setting the scene now. And that's the big shift, setting the scene to a major confrontation, both in terms of economics and possibly in politics, but also possibly militarily over the next decade or so.
And how do you see mainstream academic economics, what they call the so-called dismal science? Of course, one of the things that mainstream economics in universities and so on, one of the things they completely failed at was to predict or even to explain the 2008 and 2009 crisis. How do you see them responding to this one?
Well, they've responded more or less in the same way. The Great Recession was not predicted or forecast by the mainstream economics circles. They, in contrast to the original classical economists of capitalist economy when it began back in the early 19th century, as you say, they considered it was called a dismal science because they're always predicting a disaster. The modern mainstream economics are always predicting success. And in their view, capitalism was doing fine coming up to the Great Recession. And so it was like a bolt out of the blue that there was this massive crash in the financial sector caused by a massive crash in the housing market in the United States, which spread across the world. And this crash led to a widespread slump in production and investment. There was no prediction of that and no real explanation of that, apart from saying it was reckless behavior on the part of banks, and all we have to do is regulate them better, or there was mistakes made between imbalances between different economies, but they didn't really have any explanation. When the leaders of economics in the United States and other places were asked, they just said, well, it was just a chance in a million, it's not going to happen again, we're going to ensure the banks are stronger and so on. But of course, as I would argue, that was perfectly predictable. And some of us did predict that it would happen because of these recurring and regular slumps that capitalism has and will have. So again, when COVID came along, the argument is, well, it's like an asteroid coming out of the sky. It's a shock. It's a 1 in a million. But as I would hope to explain if we've got time, these pandemics were not chance events. Pandemics are being generated precisely through the role of capitalism's operation throughout the world globally in expanding its productive forces into areas which they haven't been before, through fossil fuel exploration, through mineral logging and so on, and also industrialization and urbanization, uncontrolled, not caring for the environment, created the conditions where human beings have become into contact with these very dangerous pathogens which existed for thousands of years in wild animals in remote parts, and now we're having it coming into the human system itself and beginning to cause these regular and different pandemics that we've had before. This is a product of capitalism, not a bolt out of the blue.
It kind of reminds me of back in 2008, 2009, when you saw those news reports talking about how sales of Marxist Capital had skyrocketed. I suppose there's a reason for that.
Well, that could be a reason. I mean, it's I'm sure your viewers will be aware that Marxist Capital, particularly the early part of Marxist Capital, is not an easy thing to read. And if people are making an effort, it shows that they want to understand what's going on with global capitalism and trying to understand the nature of its contradictions. I would recommend them perhaps to read Value, Price and Profit by Marx, which is a bit of an easier book to start with, so that they can grasp the basic ideas, or even Frederick Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, to get a grasp of the way Marxists see the contradictions in capitalism, and then they can come back to capital itself.
And one of the things you talk about in your book, The Long Depression, you talk about how this current depression is the third one. That the previous one, of course, the Great Depression, 1921, you also talk about the Long Depression in the second half of the 19th century. Could you talk about what, I suppose, are the unique features of all three, and also what they have in common with each other?
Yeah. Well, in the early part of the book, The Long Depression, which you can see to my left on your screen here, I argue that there are periods in capitalism we've seen now where, as I argued before, you have the boom and slump. Normally, the traditional recession is you have this big slump, and then once there's a cleansing going on, people are made unemployed, companies are liquidated, then there's the second half comes up and there is a recovery. So you get a V shape. So the slump and the recovery takes the form of a V shape. But there are periods, it seems, under capitalism where that V shape doesn't apply, where the recovery is so weak that you end up on a completely different trajectory than you had before. So say before capitalism had this crisis, it was growing at 4% a year for just using growth of national output. It goes down, perhaps falls 4%, but it doesn't go back up 4% and start again at 4% each year. It goes up a little and then only grows at 2%. So you have a depressionary period. And in the book, I argue there are first depression that we had like that was after 1873 to about the 1890s in most of the major economies, capitalist economies. There weren't many then. So those ones had this depressed period. It was called a depression at the time. And that meant that we continued with high unemployment, deflation, generally depressed environment before eventually recovery took place. And of course, we have in the 20th century the Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash in 1929, and then particularly in the United States, a huge fall in output and investment, and a massive increase in unemployment, and other countries too, and a very, very difficult period to come out of that. In fact, only the launch of the Second World War led to an expansion of investment into military activity and the employment of workers into uniform in a worldwide war that ended that particular depression. So I argue in the book that we actually came into a new, similar sort of depression after 2007, when profitability fell so low. We had the Great Recession, it couldn't recover. We've been in a depressionary period for the last 10 years. And this COVID may create the conditions where there could be a recovery by losing so many jobs and so many companies, but it could also just add another leg to the depression, like in the late 19th century.
And looking back at it, one of the things we can say about capitalism, how it solves crises, is by, I suppose, some of the worst things known to man. If you look at the Long Depression, and the result of that was the scramble for Africa, the carve up of the world, leading to World War I. The Great Depression, of course, leading to the rise of fascism in World War II. And it does present a very serious question. If this is a current depression, then the left and the political working class forces have an awful lot of work cut out for us. Where do you see the trajectory of capitalism as it stands now?
Well, there are two options. This particular slump that we're having could be so severe that it could have what one Austrian economist called creative destruction for capitalism. Otherwise, it would destroy all the weak sectors of the capitalist economy and allow the big, more successful and more efficient companies to take over the space, boost their profitability and start expanding again. During that period of transition, of course, millions of people are going to be unemployed before they get re-employed, but perhaps that would create, as it were, the conditions in this fire and these ashes for a phoenix to arrive and capitalism to have some sort of recovery over the next 10 years, which will boost employment and perhaps even strengthen the labour movement so that it can conduct more significant battles on its behalf. That's one option. The other one, as I was just suggesting, that's so weak are the capitalist system at the moment and so boosted up by huge amounts of money and credit being handed to them, that actually we continue with another leg of very low growth investment, low employment, another, say, 10 years of depression like we had in the 19th century. I'm not quite sure which way it's going to go. I think the latter one is more likely, but I can't be certain. So what I would say is, if that's what's going to happen, we're entering a period then where it's going to be much more intense rivalry between the major imperialist powers over getting a share of a cake that's not growing very much. So the ability to exploit workers and to get a share of the profits around the world is going to increase tensions both on trade and on technology wars, as we're already seeing in the case between China and the US, and possibly in some sort of military conflict, at least at a regional level as we progress over the next decade or so. That's not a great environment for the labour movements, is it? And the 1930s weren't. The 1880s weren't. It was only when there was a bit of a recovery that labour movement got the position where it could start having, as it were, some purchase in the class struggle to try and change things, as in the 1890s with the development of the mass trade union movements and the first start of the big second international movements in Europe and so on, and eventually leading to the third international after the Russian Revolution. But also in the period we're in now, we would have to be looking for some sort of recovery, like we had after 1945, with the recovery of the labour movement, which led to struggles in the 60s and 70s. And if you remember back, there were a number of military quasi-fascist governments that still existed in Europe, Portugal, Greece, in Spain. These were overthrown in the 70s by the movements of the working class. So we could have a singular movement too as we go into the next decade as a result. So I'm taking a very long view here. I'm saying maybe we don't see much of a struggle, except to defend what we've got now over the next 10 years, if that's the environment. And maybe we have to wait for a new period, a new change, a new set of industries, a new set of workers who are willing to and able to struggle against capital in all the various countries. Not a pleasant prospect, but I still remain confident that eventually there will be the opportunities to change this world.
And following on from that, do you see any ways that the system might use this pandemic to benefit itself?
Well, clearly so. We can see on a political level, for example, it's clear that people like Trump or Johnson are trying to use the national card to argue that America comes first, Britain comes first against Europe, America comes first against everybody else, and that it's necessary to control and reduce the influence of people who claim that there's a class struggle that's taking place within America, to continue to crush the opposition of the working people, both white and black, in the US, and a move towards more autocratic governments that ignore even the basic principles of bourgeois democracy, law and order, the right to vote, the right to register to vote, all the right to strike, all those things that could be reduced in that environment. So that's one area. The other area is to claim, well, such is the expense of us sorting out this rather surprising pandemic, we are now going to have to expect workers to pay more taxes, not to expect the same wages they had before, to have worse conditions, to privatize those sectors which are, in their view, bloated, the state sectors. So they're going to be that sort of campaign as well to reduce basic living conditions, even if we come out of this pandemic in the next year or so.
And one of the things we've seen since the pandemic, as well as before, has been the ratcheting up of what they call the new Cold War against China. Now, in your blog, you do analyse China and its political economy in a few areas. Could you talk about how you see the role of China as a player today in the global economy? How do you see growing economic competition between the United States and China?
Well, one of the things I think viewers have to think about when it comes to China is that China appears to be a huge exception to what's happened in the so-called developing world or the global south. This is an economy, a massive populated country, which was as poor, if not poorer, than India in the 1950s after the revolution that took place in China, the overthrow of the landlords and capitalists as represented by Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Army, who were driven off to the island of Formosa. You had an establishment of a government which nationalized the land and took over all the enterprises. So you have a planned collective economy, not necessarily democratic, even from the beginning, but certainly a planned collective economy. And what has been the result of planned collective enterprises in China, even if it was a poorer country, compared to India? China has dramatically improved in terms of level of national output, in the productivity of labor, of the expansion of employment. It's taken 800 million people out of poverty on World Bank standards. India has failed miserably to do that, basing itself upon the market economy and capitalism as a whole, so that China has dramatically changed its situation. And not only has it changed it for its own people, but it's become a major, the manufacturing power in the world now, and increasingly, so worryingly for imperialism, beginning to develop its own technology to the point where it can compete with the West. So increasingly, it will be able to do things on its own, much more than it was before, when it had to rely to some extent after the 1970s on foreign investment and the introduction of a market economy to some extent. So China is an exception which viewers have to think about. What's the reason for that? My view is because the capitalist mode of production, market economy, the law of value, does not operate in China sufficiently to cause disarray in the development of its economy. The state sector is very strong, the planning mechanism works, and it means that they can drive forward on investment and production and on employment in a planned way, unlike in the anarchic and uncontrolled way that happens in the West. So, but there is a conflict between the private sector, which is large in China, and the public sector and the state planning system, which is still to be resolved over the next few years. But the main issue is that now China is a major economic and technological power, and this threatens the whole basis of Western imperialism. And that is why the 21st century makes this issue the biggest one of all when it comes to how the development of the capitalist mode of production is to take place and what it means in terms of the conflicts which could arise in the future.
And returning back to the Great Depression in the 1930s, one of the things that capitalism used to respond to that was Keynesianism. How do you see today in the so-called neoliberal era, where the power of national states to make policy, to intervene in their government's economy, how can the working class, what can we expect in this neoliberal era if Keynesianism isn't able to be used now like it was in the 1930s?
Right. Well, there are two questions here, usually. First off, in a way, Keynesianism is being used right now. We have a massive rise in government spending, and big budget deficits for most of the major capitalist governments in order to try and keep the economy from collapsing and melting completely because of the pandemic lockdowns. This lockdown economy has forced the governments to spend huge amounts of money on providing subsidies to wages, providing support for businesses as well, particularly businesses, but also for wages. And that is really a massive government spending boost to the economy. But because the economy is going down by, would have gone down by, say, 40% in 1 year, unbelievable, because of the lockdowns, all these spending has helped to reduce that to some extent, but on the whole, it will still mean a huge drop. The question really is whether going forward from that, the solution to capitalism's problems is for governments to spend money either to give subsidies to the private sector, the capitalist sector, or to introduce spending programs, infrastructure programs, investment programs financed by government spending, even if it runs a deficit. I would say that actually in the Great Depression, although Roosevelt and the New Deal introduced works programs and other things, they didn't really introduce a Keynesian spending budget. They introduced directly programs to employ workers and to keep them off the dole to some extent, but unemployment was still very high during the 1930s. So the Keynesians argue either that we need a New Deal like we had in the Roosevelt, or if you come along and say, well, actually, it didn't actually do what the New Deal said it was going to do, it didn't get full employment, and it didn't return people's wages until the war came, they say, well, in that case, that was because it wasn't applied enough. What we need now is a huge government spending program. My argument to that is I'm in favor of a government spending program that's going to give people jobs, that's going to improve the investment and infrastructure of an economy. But why should we give that money to the capitalist sector, which has totally failed and has caused the crisis in the first place? Surely this is a very good case for saying that what we need is control of the commanding heights of the economy, the big banks. I've worked in banks for 40 years, and I just staggered that we still have a position where banks who have done so much damage to the world economy, every economy, through their reckless activities of speculation and so on, and their tax money laundering that they're engaged in most of the time to make their money, why these are not publicly owned and used as a service for the economy as a whole to provide credit for businesses to grow and for households to buy what they need when they can't do it through their own wages, instead of being as big speculative hedge fund operations, which what they are. They need to be publicly owned and part of the plan. And the big multinationals, the big companies that are making the huge profits that dominate the world economy, they should be part of a plan for production for need, not for profit. And we need control of the technology companies, the pharmaceutical companies who've done nothing to protect us in this COVID. The big engineering companies should be part of a program of planning to take the economy and societies forward coordinatedly around the world so that we can meet all the problems that we face now of the global warming, climate change, of the huge destruction of nature, which is going on through environmental degradation and so on, and to end the situation where there are still billions of people in poverty and unemployed without any opportunity in the future around the world. Nothing. I mean, there was a UN report recently which said that poverty the level of poverty in 1990 has not altered. 30 years later, the same proportion of people are in what can be considered by any standard in poverty as they were 30 years ago. So capitalism has failed. We need a completely different system. To say that the Keynesians have got the answer by simply spending a bit more money from the government while leaving the structure of capitalism untouched and actually and hope that this will solve the problem seems to me wrong. And if you read my books, I'll give you in more detail on why it doesn't work, because it doesn't deliver what the Keynesians think it's going to deliver.
And in the wake of Donald Trump's so-called America First policy, the growing trade war with China, Do you see this period as marking the end of neoliberal globalization?
Well, I think so. I mean, clearly at the moment we have a sharp drop in world trade, which is one of the features. What do we mean by globalization? I mean that what happened in the early 1980s was that the major capitalist economies and the companies that were in them were suffering from a severe fall in their profitability. That had happened through the mid-1960s, through the 1970s, and into the slump of the early 1980s, which is very severe around the world, particularly in the manufacturing sector. Advanced capitalist manufacturing sectors were decimated, lots of people unemployed. The big multinationals' answer to this was firstly to get the trade unions smashed in their own countries, to reduce the costs of the welfare state by privatization and cutting corporate tax and so on, but also to expand into the rest of the world where there are heaps and heaps of cheap labor that they hope to exploit by setting up factories and so on. So this globalization process was an addition to the world trade that went on between imperialist countries and developing countries. Now they actually expanded their factories, their operations into these countries to set up and to use the workforces there, which are very cheap. That's one of the basic features of that globalization period from the 1980s until the Great Recession of 2008. And what we now realize, what's now happening is because of the slumps that have taken place and because of the squeeze on the growth in output and investment and profits for the big companies around the world, that this process of globalization has reached an end, or at least a pause. It doesn't seem possible for it to be able to continue that way. So we're getting a drawing into national boundaries. Politicians look after their own nations rather than expansion. All the international agreements like the World Trade Organization, like NAFTA, like the European Union itself, all these regional level, all these things are under tremendous pressure to break up again and everybody to look after themselves because of the change in the situation in terms of profits, trade, and investment abroad. So it appears that globalization is slowed down. The data show that. So we've come to a stop in terms of capital flows, in terms of trade growth, and now it's like instead of a big cake expanding where everybody gets a bit of more share by cooperating to expand the cake is no longer growing or even shrinking, so people start fighting over trying to protect their share of it. And that's the situation we've entered now.
And to what extent do you expect this economic crisis to culminate in a financial crisis in the UK as well as the Eurozone?
Well, in the COVID crisis, I think we've had three stages. The pandemic has led to the deaths of thousands and thousands of people. As soon as the pandemic it was clear that this COVID pandemic could not be controlled because health systems were inadequate, because there'd been no work done on trying to prevent these pandemics coming, then governments were forced into these massive lockdowns. So the first stage was a collapse in supply. Production stopped. Manufacturing firms closed down. All work closed down. People were sent home from work, except for essential workers, either to work from home if they could, or not work at all. And so we had a massive reduction in production. And in the global south countries, where there isn't the sort of systems that we have in the more advanced economies, people were just unemployed, had to go home, migration took place, and so on. So it was a massive drop in production. So we had a supply shock, if you like. When you have a supply shock and it hits workers who no longer have any money to spend, apart from whatever the government gives them, and they're not getting any income coming in, then they stop spending. So they probably, and also they can't go out, so they can't go and spend and go out. So apart from having deliveries through online services and so on for the people who can afford it, spending drops. So then you have a consumption shock. So we've had two things: production shock, then a consumption shock. But as this coronavirus continues to go on, and we go up and down with lockdowns, there has not been a sufficient recovery. So the whole layer of small companies in particular, but also some larger ones who are in serious difficulty. They may have taken out a lot of loans. They may be taking out more with government help. So their debt is building up, but they're not getting any revenue. So the situation is that there could be a lot of bankruptcies in the next year coming through, which haven't had much yet, but we could get a lot more over the next year. And as a result, all the banks who have been lending their money because the government's told them to do so, will find that they've got a load of bad debts on their books. So the banks will come under pressure financially again. They're much stronger than they were in 2007, or at least so we're told. And so they supposedly can cope with a whole myriad of bad debts and bankruptcies taking place, not getting their loans paid. But we'll see. And in the so-called emerging economies, their debt has risen dramatically. So a lot of corporations there are in trouble with lots of debt, and it's debt in dollars. So the dollars is strong compared to their own currencies, the Turkish lira, South African rand, the Indian rupee, and so on. These companies could be in serious difficulty because of their foreign currency debt. So I think the third stage is a financial shock. That's still to come. Whether it can be coped with, in addition to the production shock and the consumption shock, remains to be seen without us melting down into another slump. We shall see. But in 2020, if early part of 2020 was the production shock, and the second part of 2020 is this spending or consumption shock, which hasn't recovered, 2021 could be the financial shock.
There's some discussion going on at the moment among the left on the theory of modern monetary theory. It's something our own party have looked at recently, actually. Would you have an opinion on the MMT?
Right. Well, I don't know what viewers know about modern monetary theory, but I'll tell you why it's modern or not modern, depending on what you've seen. Monetary theory, the argument is that if governments or central banks are in control of the money supply, the euro is controlled by the European Central Bank. They control the printing of it and the supply of that money, at least to begin with. The Bank of England controls the pound, and it's only allowed to print pounds. The Federal Reserve Bank in the United States is the only agency allowed to print dollars. Nobody else can make dollars. It's counterfeit. You can't do that. So whether it's in paper or whether it's on credit cards or in bank accounts, the supply to begin with is under the control of these central banks. Of course, if banks decide they want to make a loan to somebody, a company or say, so they want to loan, say, $1 million to a company, they issue a loan, it goes from the bank's accounts into the company's accounts, so the company now puts the deposit of $1 million into the bank, so it's back in the bank again. So in a way, the bank has created $1 million. It's made a loan, and then there's $1 million in the customer's account with maybe the same bank or another bank. So banks are creating money that way, but that money can only appear if the central bank allows that process to take place, the expansion of the money supply. If they want to avoid that, they could cut back on the money supply. So money is controlled by the banking system, starting with the central banks. Now, the argument of modern monetary theory is to do with how we're going to government spends money. If the government wants to spend money, there are one way. The normal way is that it raises taxes. It makes us and the businesses pay tax, mainly us, and they get tax money, and then they use that tax money to carry out government services and pay government staff and whatever. But they could spend more than that. They could spend more than they actually get in tax revenue. So how can they get the difference? Well, the traditional way is to issue a government bond, a national savings certificate. In our eyes, if we wanted to buy it, is a government bond, and it's saying, you buy this bond for £1,000, we'll pay you 2% interest each year for a year, 10 years, or whatever, how long the bond is going to last. So we get your £1,000 in addition to our tax revenue. that we've got off you, and then we can spend more than we had before just with the tax revenue. We have to pay you interest, and of course it's not us that's mainly doing this, it's banks and other institutions that are buying these bonds. So that's the traditional way of raising more government money to spend than they've got in tax revenues. Now, the modern monetary theorists say that's a complete waste of time, it's too restrictive, it leaves governments with lots of interest, debt, and you shouldn't really worry about the debt. It doesn't matter if there's a deficit and a rising debt, which is the traditional mainstream economists would say it does matter because it's got to be paid back. Modern monetary theory says no, it doesn't. All you have to do if a government wants to spend money is to get the central bank to print more money and give it to the government. And that's it. The government can then spend. It doesn't even need to raise a bond. It can just have more money. Foolproof. So then the government can go out and spend on bridges, roads, employing people, better services and welfare and so on, getting people off the dole and giving them jobs through government programs and so on. And it can all be financed by just printing more money. Well, you might say, well, what's going to happen if you print more money? Won't there be a huge mess? Won't there be inflation? So they say, well, it could be inflation, but only, says the modern monetary theorist, if you don't spend the money productively. So you need to spend it on the right thing so it produces income for people who can then pay taxes, and then the extra taxes will cover this printing of the money and so on. Well, there are so many things that I could say that raise doubts about this particular theory. The first thing to say is that people have to be sure that the money that they're getting is worth what it appears to be. If inflation rises, then you don't get much more money. If you're the Turkish central bank and you print a load of money and you give it to companies to spend, you've got a real problem, because actually most of those companies are spending it on paying their dollar debt. So, and the dollar is strong, so they ends up actually reducing the value of the Turkish lira against the dollar. Then inflation picks up because all the Turks have to buy everything from abroad in dollars, and so they need more lira. So you get inflation. As the lira goes down, there's a rise in prices. So there's no solution, modern monetary theory, for small countries. Probably only a solution even to consider for the United States, being the major economy with the strongest currency and the most important currency. But even so, this is the fundamental point of view, is that spending money by the government is no good if there's no change in the structure of the economy itself. Who is going to do the actual investing and producing? Is it going to be the government directly? Are they going to employ people directly? Are they going to invest directly? If so, the private sector is going to be crowded out. That's not going to be acceptable for them. But if it's going to be by giving money to the private sector to do things, who's to be sure that the big multinationals are going to spend the money they're getting extra from this process on productive employment and investment, and not on speculation in the financial market and so on, when they think that the profitability of productive investment is low? If the productive investment profitability is low, then increasing the amount of spending, whether it's by printing money, as the monetary theory says, or traditional Keynesian methods by issuing bonds, won't solve the problem. And so MMT is really just a more extreme way of thinking about Keynesian government spending. The difference between that and traditional Keynesian views is that government spending solves everything. We don't need to touch the structure of the economy, but we also don't need to issue bonds. We can just print money. The argument is that I don't think that's possible if you don't change the structure of the capitalist economy so that you can actually control and develop the productive forces. And secondly, in countries outside the United States, printing more Zambian currency or Zimbabwe currency will probably lead to massive inflation rather than taking the economy forward.
And if we
That's a short answer, not very short. I can assure you, to answer it, you have to go and read some of the posts I've written and the papers I've written, because modern monetary theory is now a business on its own. There are thousands and thousands of articles by academics arguing for and against.
We will be sure to have a look at some more of your postings on it. Just a question: if we have a recovery and the velocity of the money supply returns to pre-crisis levels, what does this mean for interest rates and inflation more broadly?
Yes, well, inflation is a conundrum that's very difficult for people to grasp about why we have inflation. I mean, the obvious thing is, the usual thing is, well, if people have more money than they can buy things with, then the prices of things rise and you get inflation. But that doesn't really answer the question, because the question has to be, why are there not being more produced? And I would argue, as a Marxist economist, that the reason things are not being more produced is because there's a general tendency to reduce the amount of profit that you can get out of producing them over time. If that happens, then the profits that come to capitalists begin to decline relatively. They're still increasing, but compared to the amount of production, they'll be relatively smaller, and it also affects the wages of workers. So the two powers to increase prices, namely capitalists buying things and workers buying things, are being forced downwards, actually, because of the production of commodities is growing faster than the value that's being produced by workers and appropriated by capitalists in the form of profits. So you'd expect actually inflation to fall or to deflate it. And that's a general tendency. But that's bad news for capitalism. They prefer to have rising prices to some extent. Why? Because they want the market to be expanding and they want prices to be, if prices are falling, they're going to lose money. So because they've invested in things that expand and then the prices tend to fall. So they want a mechanism by which prices are kept up. One of the ways to do that, apart from monopolies, but that doesn't apply to everybody, is for the central banks to boost money supply. So as we just discussed, so that it increases the amount of money that people are holding, either in wages or in profits, and that will increase spending power. But that can't be controlled. So you've got a situation where you can have too much money supply, and then it causes a rising inflation, or too little money supply, because there's generally a move towards lower and lower inflation and deflation. What will happen in the current environment is when you have a production and consumption shock, of course, if nothing's being spent and nothing's being produced, inflation drops really quite far. But as soon as spending picks up a bit and the production doesn't, then you start to get a bit of inflation, which has started to happen in the second half of this year. And because of the huge amount of money spending or injection that's going on by federal banks, if we continue to have that process, I expect inflation to pick up again in the next couple of years. It dropped almost to zero at the beginning of 2020 in COVID in the major economies, and now expected to rise back to 2 or 3%. Inflation is good for capitalism as long as it's not hyperinflation, but it's bad for workers, isn't it? It's obviously bad for workers because it means the wages we're getting are not delivering the same sort of purchasing power that we require. If everyday electricity tariffs go up, if health insurance goes up, if transport goes up, inflation rises, and we're not getting the wages to match it, then our real incomes are falling. So inflation on the whole is bad news for workers. It's not so bad news for capitalists. That's why the capitalists quite everywhere are trying to get a bit of inflation. They want that.
Another one of the questions we've been sent in is, how do you see the phenomenon of ecofascism playing out, where the middle classes of imperialist countries will support their consumption levels while being maintained at the expense of the exploitation of the global south?
Right. Well, I think it's an important question. The first thing to remember is that I don't think the ordinary working person in countries like Britain or Ireland or the United States are eco-fascists and overspending and causing problems for the global south. The problem, whether it comes to climate change and carbon emissions, is the top 1%. They're the ones that are the biggest carbon emitters in the world amongst the populations of the global north. Global north on the whole is relative to its population, is a huge emitter of global carbon. The multinationals and imperialism in the global north are the causes of the environmental destruction in the global south as a result, and also for the exploitation of the workers there. But the fundamental point here is that imperialism is the problem here, both for climate change, inequality of wealth, exploitation of global south. And what do I mean by imperialism? I mean the big multinationals, the big banks that control the tentacles of the world in general and decide our lives, not the workers of the north. They are just as exploited. They're exploited by their own capitalists. They might be on a slightly better standard of living than the majority of the global south, but that's not a product of them being part of an eco-fascist plot within the global north. And I think we have to remember that workers of the north and workers of the global south have a lot more in common than than we would imagine, than saying that we have in common with our own nation. And that is the issue that we have to be clear about, that the answer to the exploitation of the global south is a change in the capitalist structure of those countries through the movements of the workers in those countries, but also through the overthrow and change of the structure in the imperialist countries. Because unless we change the imperialist structures in the global north, in the US and Europe and so on, there will continue to be a force that will exploit the global south and their own workers.
And some of the myths and illusions created around capitalism, that it's the most efficient utilization of resources and all the rest of it. How do you see this current crisis as further showing those myths and illusions for what they are?
Yes, indeed. Antonio Guterres is the UN Secretary General. He recently made a very interesting speech about a month ago when he said what the COVID has shown is the rottenness of the capitalist society. I mean, this is the UN Secretary General. He didn't use the word capitalist, but that's what it amounted to. And he says it shows the fiction and lies that we have an equal world. It shows the lie that everybody has been in the same boat in COVID. Well, we know that's not the case. People on the frontline workers have been taking the biggest risks with the lowest pay. That it's the less healthy people, poorer people who have taken the hit both in the infections and the deaths as a result, and it's the poorest and the working people who have taken the hit economically as well, while the big multinationals and the owners of those big tech companies are making thousands and thousands of dollars a second. I mean, the wealth of people like Jeff Bezos, of the Facebook chairman and all the rest of them, they have made billions during the period of the COVID as a result of the expansion of the stock market and as a result of the expansion of their particular industries in their role, while billions of people are being forced into poverty as a result of COVID. So there is no equality, said Antonio Guterres. And he said so it's a lie that people are in the same boat, that they've been fairly treated, that there is a possibility for inequality, that any step is being made on dealing with global warming, climate change, and environmental destruction. He said it's just not happening. And then he makes an appeal to the world governments and say it's time we got together and did something about it. Of course, there's no hope of the current set of government leaders in the major economies doing any such thing. There is no cooperation between the major governments at the moment to deal with the tremendous problems of poverty, of debt in the global south, to deal with the situation for workers in the advanced capitalist countries as well. All they're interested in is trying to keep their share of the market going and to support their own capitalist businesses. If that means giving a bit of money to workers to stop them, to keep them on board for work ahead, okay, but that's not their main intention. Their main intention is to preserve the capitalist system at the expense of other capitalist systems if it comes to that. So there's no cooperation and there's no attempt to reset the economy in a way which would deal with inequality, deal with climate change, deal with environmental destruction, deal with the need to end future crises and pandemics.
There is some discussion among Marxists around where exactly we can pinpoint the origins of this crisis of capitalism. For instance, I believe some people in the Monthly Review Journal put it as a crisis originating from monopolization, whereas you would put it squarely as something that can be explained by Marx's tendency, the rate of profit to fall. How do you feel that theory has stood up in this crisis?
Which theory, the monopoly one or
the tendency, the rate of profit to fall?
Right. Well, I mean, first, clearly there are monopolies in capitalism. There are, by what we mean, there's not any real true monopoly. There's not a monopoly. Strictly means one company controls the whole market or the whole sector that they're involved in. That really isn't the case. What you have is what you might call oligopolies, a small group of big companies that control the vast majority of the market. Take the tech market, or the FANGs, they call the 5 or 6 companies that control the tech and media market, tech media market. The banks, similarly, maybe 20, 30 banks in the world controlling basically most of the finance of the world. So we have oligopolies. There's no doubt about that. But the point is that oligopolies are not stuck in stone. There's a process of competition and drive amongst capitalism, whether it's internationally or even nationally, between companies to try and get market share. So the competitive drive of capitalism is still there to try and get more profits, and that means they will undermine oligopolies and monopolies if they can, either with new techniques, new sectors to sell to, and so on. So if you think 60 years ago, General Motors might have been the biggest company in the United States, and what General Motors decided everything. That's a sort of monopoly in the car industry, or an oligopoly. Now, General Motors is nothing. It's not a decisive factor in the capitalist economy of the United States, where it's a whole series of different industries and different monopolies. If you go further back, it was the steel monopolies and then the rail monopolies. So my argument is that monopolies are not really deciding the issue of what happens to capitalism. What happens to capitalism is what happening to profits. That's the key guide for you to understand whether capitalism is doing well or doing badly, and whether it's going to hit us harder or whether we can get some gains out of it. If profitability is falling, then capitalism increasingly finds it more difficult to expand investment and production and employment. Now, the evidence shows, and that's not just me that has looked at the evidence, that over the last 150 years of capitalism, if we look at a world scale or in different countries, the profitability of capital, that means adding up all the profits in an economy and dividing it by all the invested stock of machinery and raw materials that capitalists got and the employment, and making a ratio of that, which is the rate of profit, that rate has over 150 years or so fallen. It's not anywhere near as high as it was in the 1850s. And it's not in a straight line. There are periods when it goes up, particularly after wars or after big slumps. But generally, the pressure is down. That tells me 2 things. One, which we discussed first, Eugene, which was that it causes regular and recurring crises when the profitability falls and hits profits in general. But also it tells you that capitalism is going nowhere. That capitalism is a system to expand, meet the social needs of 7 billion people, is not able to do that because it will only expand if profits increase. And if profitability tends to fall over a period of time, long periods of time, decades maybe, then you get crises, which means capitalism is not a system that can take us forward to solve all the issues of poverty that I've been talking about before. So what it tells you is that you need some other system. You need a system where you plan, where there is common ownership, where there is cooperation, where we use all the resources together in a planned way to meet the needs of people, not to meet the very small number of people who own the monopolies or the big companies. So the argument, That is the key argument, in my view, to understand capitalism. The argument that it's monopolies that are the problem has a certain problem with it, because if you're really saying is that if we get rid of monopolies and we have competitive capitalism, so capitalism competes against each other, we break up the big companies, we break up Amazon, we break up Facebook, we break up the big banks and make them small and let them compete against each other, then our problems are resolved because it's the problem of monopoly. No, it's not the problem of monopoly. It's the problem of capitalism and the fact that it is in contradiction between what we need and its need to make profits. And that contradiction lies at the essence of what is wrong with the current system.
And how do you see automation ensuring profitability for capitalists once workers are gradually replaced by machines and so on? Do you think a lot of the worries about automation are well-founded or exaggerated?
Well, throughout the history of the industrial revolution of capitalism, what we've seen, if we go back to agricultural societies back in the early 18th century, we began to get the expansion of farming on a capitalist basis, farming for profit. And then it became, in the towns, you get the development of trade, so trading for profit. So we begin to get basic embryos of what capitalism is about, producing things for profit, trading and producing farm goods for profit. But then we have the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution transforms things in a dramatic way. It's Engels' 200th anniversary of his birth this year. And he wrote a book, two books, but in particular the book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. And we wrote that in 1844, and he describes how the dramatic development of machine production, of which he was a part because his family owned a cotton mill in Manchester. He shows the tremendous movement towards away from just having lots of workers producing things, either in homes or even in bigger areas, to building huge great machines, cotton mills, other things, iron and steel factories and so on. And so machinery became the way in which capitalists expanded production. Why? Because by using machinery, they could reduce the amount of work costs of the workers that they had, and they could replace it with a big increase in production using machines. So a worker that could produce two t-shirts a day was now given a machine and can produce 200 t-shirts a day. So you don't need so many workers as well, or even if you keep that one worker, you're now producing a lot more. So the process of capitalism led to the massive expansion of mechanization. And automation in the 21st century is just another form of that. It's expanding the mechanization. So the fundamental trend under capitalism has been to expand investment in machinery and robots, which is a form of machine, a more advanced form of machine, relative to the amount of workers that you're using. And that increases the production, but it should, if it was a proper, fair, humane system, reduce the hours of work for workers. But instead, what it means is lots of workers get unemployed, and the situation means that you have an increased amount of what Marx and Engels called a reserve army of labor, extra workers that capitalists no longer need because they're using machines. But here is the contradiction. If they don't use workers, then the amount, and think about it this way, viewers, you can have as many machines as you like, but if you're not there, nobody's there to press the button, to maintain them, to turn the lights on, whatever, there's nothing produced. Machines do not produce value. They only produce value if human beings act with them to produce value, whether it's extra commodities or whether it's profits for the capitalists. So the capitalists cannot do without workers. They can reduce relative to the number that they've got, but they can't get rid of human labor power, at least not yet. So we're in a position where less human labor power relative to machines is being used. A massive expansion of those machines means that costs rise for the capitalists relative to the amount of value they're actually getting because they're using less workers. So profitability begins to fall. That's the fundamental law of profitability. And there's a contradiction then between increased production using machines and a pressure downwards on the profitability of using that process. Now, with automation and robots, this is the argument. The argument is that we can move to a society where robots do everything for us. We don't need human labor. Robots turn on the lights, they make other robots, they design new robots. There's no human labor involved whatsoever. That would be fantastic, don't you think? I think it would be. It means that we would presumably have so much, we'd have loads of time because we wouldn't have to work. Robots would be doing everything, and so we could concentrate on more interesting things like, well, I leave it for you to decide what you think is more interesting for human beings to do in your case. But you'd have that tremendous power to decide and create on a creative level of what we might call work. We would move away from toil, having to work for a living, to moving to living for work, which would be a transformation of human beings in general. But, of course, that is not possible. That's not possible to happen under capitalism, because capitalism is going to allow everybody to go and do nothing. It won't mean a reduction in hours. In fact, the expansion of robots and machines have led to a general increase in hours because people are putting more hours in to boost capitalist profits. So, but you could get a situation where there's just machines. If there's just machines, there's no value being created. It's a completely different society. The machines are like slaves. It's like a slave society. The question then is, who owns the machines? Is it owned by us all in common to provide the social needs of the world and reduce our hours? Or is it owned by a tiny elite who control all that, have their all life, and the rest of us are destitute? I would argue that before we ever get to that point, there will be a major class struggle about how that would operate. So we're not at that point. That's the final point I make. It's quite a long answer, I'm sorry. But the final point is that we're not at the position where robots make robots make robots. We're a position where there's increasing mechanization, and we're now using more robots and artificial intelligence, which is increasing the ability to produce things and services without the use of human labor, which is good news. But we're way, way short of that replacing human labor power at the moment. I answer that always by saying, okay, so a robot can solve a problem, or it can make a computer like the printing machines that we have now, robot printing and so on. But can it play tennis? Can it throw a ball in the air and hit the ball in? No, it can't do lots of things which human beings can still do. Maybe it will in the future, but at the moment, we're a long way from what is called in the language singularity, where robots are actually replace everything we can do and do it better. We haven't got there, possibly not in this century, if at all.
And as a final question, if there is a continued fall in the rate of profit, is there an end point of profitability, and what would it mean for the productive forces?
Yeah, I was trying to work that out the other day. This usual question, depending on what the profit level. Let's take a profit level of 20%. So let's say the world rate of profit is 20%, and it's falling by, let's say, this is correct, by 1% a year. Viewers can work that out, but it's going to go to zero in 20 years, you can see. So that's the end of the world, is it? The end of capitalism in 20 years, because the profit rate goes from 20% to zero in 20 years. Well, the answer, of course, it doesn't go down that fast. And secondly, the very nature of the booms and slumps in capitalism mean that there's periods of time when the profit rate goes up, because we've got rid of old capital and labor. We've reduced capitalists, have reduced costs, they've raised the profitability, perhaps at a new lower level of production for a while, but a higher rate of profit. And so we get a boost in the profitability, which could last 15, 20 years. After world wars, certainly after the Second World War, there was a big rise in the rate of profit, which lasted at least until the mid-1960s, 20 years. So if you look at actually the trajectory of the rate of profit on a world scale or in different countries, and you do a little bit of a mathematical calculation that way, the rate of profit wouldn't fall to zero probably this century, if assuming that, who knows what's going to happen in the next 8 decades ahead of us in terms of capitalism. So we don't have to look at it quite so, as I might call linearly. It's not going to be straight down to zero. And that's the end of capitalism. What the rate of profit tells us of, and the impression of it's going down and the tendency to go down, is the transitory nature of capitalism. It can't last forever. It doesn't solve the problems. It's going to find it more and more difficult to solve our needs and meet our needs, because it only is interested, the system is interested in providing profits for a very small group of people who own the means of production. And they will operate in a way to try and raise their profits, which actually make it impossible for the rest of us to achieve our social needs, not only on a regular and recurring basis in crises, but over the long term as well. Things can only continue to get worse in terms of meeting social need because of the blockage of a profit-making system of production.
And Michael, I suppose, unfortunately, we're at the end of this discussion here. Would there be any concluding remarks you'd like to make?
No, it's been, I don't know the feedback, but I hope you'll find some feedback from your viewers and people who participated today in the Zoom webinar. We've got a lot of big problems ahead for the labour movement. If and when we come out of this pandemic and the crisis it's caused, we need to be thinking about how to reset the economy and to get the labour movement adopting the policies which can reset not only our local economy like Ireland, but also the world. We need to build, first of all, we have to defend the rights that workers have had, their wages and conditions when if and when they get back to work, not have them taken away by employers. We need to start a real campaign to build a proper health and protective system to prevent future pandemics, and health systems that protect us, not to have them privatized and decimated, but to be fully funded. That's a struggle that has popular support amongst the mass of people in many countries. So the labour movement should be leading that process. And we need to raise the idea that we need to change the actual structure of the capitalist economy so that we don't go into a further crisis and more pandemics, and we can solve the big world issues ahead of us, not only of inequality, but of climate change and environmental destruction. And we need to go forward in that way, that in a position of cooperation amongst the labour movement to avoid the serious dangers over the next 2 decades of conflict between the imperialist powers. So there's a big task ahead of us. I probably won't be with you at the end, Eugene, but I'm hoping that you youngsters I see now will be able to do that.
Don't worry, we will. I suppose, to paraphrase Che Guevara, it's not our fault if reality is Marxist. Could have a quote that jumped out at me during your presentation. So once again, Michael, thanks very much for coming on tonight. All of us, I think, have learned an awful lot. Once again, for anybody looking to keep up with Michael, you can keep up his blog, The Next Recession, at WordPress, as well as check out some of his books. I think he has 2 of them there in his
the other way. Here we go.
over there. And once again, Michael, thank you very much for coming on, and thanks again to our audience.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.